Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to you all to our very first module as part of the Guide to Gender Mainstreaming in African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA National Strategies. My name is Nadira Bayat. I'm the Gender and Trade Expert at the African Trade Policy Center, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and I will be leading you through Module 1 up to Module 4. So if you're ready, let us begin. As I said, Module 1 will be dealing with the AFCFTA, gender and development. At the end of Module 1, participants should be able to, number one, demonstrate a strong understanding of the key features, objectives, and institutional arrangements of the agreement establishing the AFCFTA. Number two, you should be able to assess the complex bidirectional trade and gender relationship and recognize the relevance and the importance of this relationship for understanding how intra-African trade can unlock gender equality as an instrument for sustainable development. You should also be able to recognize that AFCFTA market liberalization will likely impact women and men differently, and that there is a need for proactive measures that remove gendered barriers to trade and create quality jobs and equal opportunities for women and men under the AFCFTA. And lastly, you should be able to articulate the need for AFCFTA and related trade policy design that is inclusive and pays specific attention to women, particularly to ensuring that certain vulnerable segments of women are not left behind towards the establishment of the AFCFTA. Now, we see that as an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction. Building links through trade can have a profound impact on economies. Equitable trade enables countries to achieve decent employment opportunities, food security, to promote technology transfer, and economic and social infrastructure development. In spurring economic growth, trade also makes other resources available that contribute to poverty reduction targets and a range of development goals that lie at the heart of national, regional, and global development agendas. But notwithstanding this vast potential of trade, many African countries have not been able to unlock the benefits and to use trade effectively as a tool for poverty reduction. Now, some of the reasons for this include high trade costs and services restrictions on the continent, higher than average tariffs for intra-African exports than for exports to the rest of the world, limited productive capacities that have boxed African countries into the export of primary commodities with little value added. But with regard to global trade, it's really well recognized that most African countries are too small to effectively compete with highly industrialized countries, both in terms of skills, productivity, technology, and economies of scale. There are also challenges of restricted market access, unbalanced rules, lack of access to trade finance, and quality capacity building programs. All of these challenges have accumulated and resulted in limiting the trading potential of countries, resulting in missed opportunities to use trade as an engine for effective development. Our next slide examines the roadmap towards an African economic community. Now, over the years, efforts towards deepening economic, social, and political cooperation and integration on the continent have resulted in a number of treaties, protocols, and conventions, and many other formal agreements entered into by sovereign states, Pan-African organizations, and regional economic communities. And as far back as 1910, the first regional integration initiative on the continent was the South African Customs Union. And over the years, we will recall the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, a political program in the history of regional integration on the continent that was given legal expression in the historic treaty establishing the African Economic Community, the Abuja Treaty. Now, the Abuja Treaty was signed in 1991 and entered into force in 1994 with very specific objectives that include the promotion of economic, social, and cultural development and the integration of African economies in order to increase economic self-reliance and self-sustained development. And if you look very closely at the slide, you will see the roadmap towards an African Economic Community, starting from stage 1 up until stage 6. In recent years, African countries have vigorously pursued continental market integration as a collective development and transformation strategy. At the African Union Summit, at its 18th assembly held in Addis Ababa in January 2012, heads of state and government endorsed the Action Plan for Boosting Intra-African Trade, or the BIAT. Now, this was the precursor to the AFCFTA. Recognizing the importance of intra-African trade as a fundamental factor for sustainable economic development, employment generation, and effective integration of Africa into the global economy, the summit also called for the fast-tracking of the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area by an indicative date of 2017, with the option to review the target date according to progress made. Now, you will see that the AFCFTA does not feature explicitly in the AU roadmap, but and specifically in accordance with the sequential stages of regional economic integration that we saw on the slide before this. It is, however, a stepping stone to the creation of a continental customs union. Moving on to the AFCFTA agreement. The framework agreement establishing the AFCFTA was negotiated from 2016 to 2018. The agreement was opened for signature and signed by 44 AU member states on 21 March 2018 at the 10th Extraordinary Summit of AU Heads of State and Government in Kigali, Rwanda. And this was signed in parallel with the Kigali Declaration and the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community relating to the free movement of persons, right of residence, and right of establishment. To date, 54 of the 55 AU member states have signed the AFCFTA agreement, and 30 countries have ratified the agreement. The AFCFTA agreement entered into force on 30th May 2019, 30 days after the deposit of the 22nd instrument of ratification. Now, the scope of the AFCFTA agreement is large. In terms of the agreement, AU member states are required to progressively remove tariffs on intra-African trade, making it easier for African countries to trade within the continent and to benefit from a growing African market. The AFCFTA agreement covers trade in goods and services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy, and other policy areas. And these include trade facilitation and services, regulatory measures such as technical barriers to trade, and sanitary standards. Now, while a traditional free trade area would typically require only the elimination of tariffs and quotas on trade in goods, the AFCFTA agreement covers, in addition to trade in goods and services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy. And as we have seen, there are additional policy areas that are included in terms of the agreement. Now, the operational instruments to support the operational phase of the AFCFTA was concluded. And these were launched at the 12th Extraordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union, held in Niamey, Niger, on 12th July 2019. In terms of the agreement, we have the rules of origin, we have the online tariff negotiation portal, and the Continental Online Mechanism for Monitoring, Reporting, and Elimination of Non-Tariff Barriers. We also have the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System and the African Trade Observatory. And as I said, the operational phase of the AFCFTA was launched at the 12th Extraordinary Summit of the Assembly of the African Union held in Niamey, Niger on 7 July 2019. Now, it's important to note that the African Trade Observatory is particularly important in that it will provide policymakers, investors, and stakeholders with reliable data and trade statistics. And this will enable them to identify market opportunities and will help them to facilitate the effective monitoring of the implementation of the agreement. Once it's in force, it will also promote planning and policy making. And we're also going to be talking throughout the course on the other operational instruments, and particularly the Continental Online Mechanism for Monitoring and Reporting and Elimination of Non-Tariff Barriers, which is particularly important, and the rules of origin. But I wanted to draw your attention specifically to the African Trade Observatory. Now, moving on to the implications and the potential benefits of the AFCFTA. The start of trading of the AFCFTA agreement, as you all know, was set to commence on the 1st of July 2020, but this has been postponed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the start of trading has been postponed to 1st of January 2021. Now, the postponement of the AFCFTA is one of the many casualties of the pandemic. And as we know, Africa has and will continue to be deeply impacted by COVID-19. And once again, we will be examining the consequences and the implications that the pandemic has in various economic sectors and on various groups, particularly on groups of women throughout the course. Now, when effectively implemented, the AFCFTA can help to boost industrialization and investment. It can help to advance food security, agriculture, and infrastructure development. It can also help to create higher paying productive jobs, enhancing sustainable development outcomes. In accordance with estimates from the Economic Commission for Africa, we see intra-African exports of industrial products that are expected to increase by 25 to 30%, or 36 to 43 billion in 2040. And this is relative to the baseline without the AFCFTA in place. Increases are anticipated to be the largest in intra-regional trade in manufacturing, and particularly in wearing apparel, in textiles, vehicles, and transport equipment, also in wood and paper, leather, and electronics. It's not only industrial products that are expected to increase. Intra-African exports of agriculture and food products are also forecast to increase by 20 to 35%, or 10 to 17 billion. And these gains are expected to be more pronounced for exports in meat products, in milk and dairy products, in sugar, in beverages and tobacco, vegetables, fruit, and processed rice. Now, the World Bank has undertaken a recent study, and according to World Bank group estimates, economic growth in Africa is projected to decline from 24% in 2019 to minus 2.1 to minus 5.1% in 2020. And this really is the first recession in the region over the past quarter century, arising from COVID-19. So it's really important to look at the potential benefits of the AFCFTA and contrast this to the estimated losses that are projected for the continent. The AFCFTA is also accompanied by specific benefits in terms that are expected to arise both from decreased tariffs, which remain stubbornly high in many parts of the country, But greater gains are expected to come from lowering trade costs, and particularly by reducing non-tariff barriers and improving hard and soft infrastructure at the borders. And these are the trade facilitation measures. So once again, it's important in terms of your reflections and understandings of the potential gains and benefits of the AFCFTA to also juxtapose and to contrast this with the expected losses that are anticipated to arise from COVID-19. Moving on to the next slide is a closer examination of the potential benefits of the AFCFTA and key features of these benefits. Now, when we look at the architecture and key features of the AFCFTA agreement, we see that the agreement comprises of three specific layers. There's the framework agreement that defines in general terms the purposes and intentions of the agreement, that establishes its primary definition and outlines its scope. There are also the protocols to the agreement, the trade in services, trade in goods, trade in services, rules and procedures for the settlement of disputes, investment, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. And there's the annexures, the guidelines, lists, and schedules to the protocols that articulate the provisions of the protocol in greater detail. Now, the overarching goal of the framework agreement establishing the AFCFTA is really to create a liberalized continental market for goods and services that's facilitated by the movement of persons, with a view to ensuring the stronger integration of African economies in support of the continent's development agenda. Articles 3 and 4 of the AFCFTA agreement set out the general and specific objectives and the obligations of state parties in respect of these objectives. And I want you to really reflect on what these general objectives are, what the specific objectives are. They set out in your module, and to understand the responsibilities of state parties in respect of these objectives. Now, the architecture of the agreement establishing the AFCFTA is set out in Appendix 1. And again, it will be important for you to closely interrogate what the architecture of the agreement is, to read it, to study it, and to understand the objectives, to understand the provisions, and what they mean, what it means for your respective country. When we look at AFCFTA negotiations, we see that they have been split into the following phases. Phase 1, protocols that cover trade in goods, trade in services, and rules and procedures for the settlement of disputes, have been concluded as part of Phase 1 negotiations. Now, Phase 2 negotiations that will commence shortly cover protocols on investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy. And these are to be concluded by June 2021. Phase 3 negotiations will then be concluded following the conclusion of Phase 2 negotiations. In accordance with the decision adopted at the 33rd Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the Union, Phase 3 negotiations will focus on an AFCFTA protocol on e-commerce, and as I mentioned, will commence immediately after the conclusion of Phase 2 negotiations. So we have established that the scope of the AFCFTA agreement is large. A single market that's created under the AFCFTA agreement that connects 1.27 billion consumers across 55 countries with an aggregate GDP of between 2.1 and 3.4 trillion US dollars is expected to bring tremendous benefits to the continent. And in establishing this one single market for goods and services on the continent, we see how the AFCFTA really addresses the challenges of small and fragmented markets that plague African economies. We go to the next slide on the AFCFTA architecture and key features. And once again, I would urge you to examine the framework agreement establishing the AFCFTA, the protocol and goods and on trade in goods, what the various annexes are. We have Annex 1 from schedules of tariff concessions to Annex 9 on trade remedies. We have the protocol on trade in services that covers schedules of specific commitments. We have the protocol on dispute settlement, and of course, the protocols on intellectual property rights, on competition policy and investment that are to be concluded by June 2021. So please, I urge you to take your time to go through the AFCFTA agreement themselves. Don't limit yourself to the slides, to the material in the modules, but really interrogate, understand the AFCFTA architecture, the key features of the various protocols, and the implications of what this could bring to your continent, to our continent, and to our respective countries. We go on